Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the ASTIS webinar on how much is your monitoring well really actually costing you. My name is Michelle Lottie. I'm here just to help out Sam with the webinar. And I'd like to introduce Sam, who's our speaker, Samantha Franson, sorry. She is a hydrogeophysicist and a project manager here at ASTIS. She's got about 7 years experience in subsurface characterization and geophysical data acquisition, integration, and interpretation. Samantha leads multidisciplinary teams of geologists, hydrogeologists, and geophysicists in delivering high-resolution subsurface imaging and interpretation for groundwater resources management and remedial design characterization. Her experience includes work on complex sites across the U.S., mapping fracture networks and identifying mechanisms controlling contaminant migration to produce actionable 3D visual models that are used by project stakeholders to make informed decisions and mitigate risk. And Sam is actually based out of State Line, Nevada, so she's having fun out there. So welcome everybody, and Sam, I will let you take over.
Okay, great. Thank you, Michelle, for the intro. So as Michelle said, I am a hydrogeophysicist and project manager. So as we're tackling this question today of how much is your monitoring well actually costing you, we are going to be looking at it from both a technical and a management approach. So there's actually quite a few things that we're going to be going through today. We're going to start off by talking about, is your monitoring well actually helping or hurting your conceptual site model? And so through that discussion, we're going to be taking a very candid look at monitoring wells and what are they doing for us in the environmental industry. We're then going to compare a different approach to site characterization, drilling versus a scan-first approach. Then talk about ASIS's more robust scan-first approach, electrical hydrogeology, look at the underlying principles and applications, where we actually will look at a few real-life case studies of how this process was applied and the positive impacts that it had on the project objectives. Then we'll talk very briefly about the GeoTrax survey difference. So what is different about the ASIS scan-first approach versus other scan-first approaches that could be out there. And then finally, we'll close with some big picture questions and comments on site characterization in the environmental industry as a whole. During this presentation, I'm going to have 2 spots for Q&A. So we're going to pause about midway through for some questions, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. My goal is to only be speaking for about 40 minutes. But that being said, please feel free to drop questions in the chat as we move through. If it's something I can address quickly, I will happily do so. Otherwise, we'll hold it until one of the Q&A sessions. So with that, let's dive in and start talking about monitoring wells. So first off, just want to call out a few monitoring well misconceptions, right? We said we were going to take a candid look at these, and so we are going to hold no punches here. So first off, monitoring wells are just that. They are monitoring wells. They are really great if you want to monitor subsurface conditions at a specific location, right? But what we've actually been using them as is characterization wells. And the reason that the environmental industry started using monitoring wells in that way is because of some early assumptions, right? We said, oh, you just have to stick a well on the ground. It's going to tell you everything you need to know about the subsurface. You don't have to do any QA, QC or development, no routine maintenance. And this is fine because our sites are simple. There's just one source. There's just one pathway. All of the geology is homogeneous isotropic, right? Great conditions. Super easy, just need wells, right? But what we've seen is that these assumptions actually don't hold up. There have been a lot of advancements made in well installation and development, and we know that our sites are not that simple. But what's pretty fascinating is there's actually one study done where they did have those kind of site conditions. It was a fairly homogeneous isotropic subsurface. It was a very consistent gravel sand aquifer, and they wanted to understand how this plume was moving through that aquifer. And what they found was even under those ideal conditions, it still took about 10,000 wells to actually see what was going on in the subsurface. So when you look at what we have to deal with in the environmental industry, right, understanding a complex fracture network, understanding complex subsurface pathways that are influenced by very discrete permeability changes. You know, how many wells would it actually take to see that, to really understand those kinds of subsurface conditions. And so at this point, we're going to transition to looking at what research says. Well, can the wells tell us enough? And IRT takes a big picture look and says, well, if you do want to clean up your site and you want to have more effective remedies, then you do need to invest some time on the front end. Turn on my laser pointer here. So what they looked at is they said, if you do not spend a lot of time on characterization, then sure, you'll save some time and money up front, but you'll end up spending it on the back end because you're going to be trying remedy after remedy, and those aren't going to be effective. And that's not a comment on the remediation techniques that are out there. We have made huge advancements as an industry in remediation techniques. And so we are better than ever at actually cleaning up the subsurface. But it all comes down to, do you know where the stuff actually is, right? So ITRC says if you do spend some time on characterization, then you're going to follow this blue line. And you'll actually end up saving both time and money on the back end on an overall project basis. But where this research ends is it just says, spend time, you need a good CSM. This next study done by the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program took an even more detailed look at that and said, well, that makes sense. If you spend more money on characterization, you should save money on remediation. Let's see if that holds up. And their research was really fascinating. So the premise of the study, and people have probably seen this, I think it's a pretty famous one in the environmental industry at this point, but the premise was they generated 3 virtual site data sets, right? So of varying levels of complexity. So this is great. We don't always have an answer booklet when we're doing a site investigation. This study had the answer booklet. They knew exactly what the site conditions were. And they did make sure that they were modeled such that normal heterogeneous conditions existed in these 3 different virtual site data sets. They then took 4 highly qualified decision maker teams and had them investigate the site and generate a CSM for each of the sites and a remedial strategy for each of the sites. And these are a few of the results that came out. And again, this is a really robust study. There are a lot more results than what I'm presenting here today. But what was really striking was that the only investigation tools these teams were allowed to use were vertical tools. So they could use monitoring wells, soil borings, MIP, HPT data, but they specifically did not allow the use of geophysics on this site. And what they found was that 0% of these CSMs resulted in a remedial strategy that achieved success, so met all of the project objectives at a reasonable cost. 75% of them didn't achieve success at all using the CSMs that they built using these vertical tools. And even more striking is that 0% of those investigative strategies resulted in high accuracy for all the CSM metrics across the board. So this study says we've been doing it this way and we are not getting to good answers. And they found that the most common pitfalls of the accurate CSM development was 1, underestimating subsurface heterogeneity, right, which is really easy to do when you have very discrete samples. And that's because if you don't have sufficient density of your subsurface data, how are you supposed to understand the subsurface heterogeneity? And then even more interestingly was they found that most of these teams, despite being highly qualified, experienced professionals, sometimes asked too much of these data sets. So they called out poor interpretation of these data sets as one of the key failings of developing a good CSM. And that's because they were using some of these tools inappropriately and asking it to understand too much about the subsurface, right? More than you could actually extrapolate from what these vertical tools can tell you. So this study basically tells us, okay, we need a good CSM to get good remediation results, but you can't do it with vertical tools alone. That's definitely not cutting it. The EPA took this another step and they looked at UST release sites. They had 3 teams of experts on, and they were asked to estimate how much could high resolution site characterization save on a project over the overall course of the project's lifetime. And they found that the experts estimated that using high resolution site characterization, so not just wells, they could save roughly 3 to 8 years, even as much as 10 years, or 9 to 19% on an overall cost basis for the project. So we're starting to head towards a direction of, okay, we know we need to do better on our CSMs, so we can do better on our remediation. And it seems like high resolution site characterization is the answer. But even within that realm, there are a lot of different options for high resolution site characterization. So to figure out what the right answer is, we can actually look at other industries, right? What is the best tool when you want to understand something you cannot just see with your eyes? And what we see is that these other industries that need to see below the surface evolve to a scan first, then invasive procedure. So think about the medical industry. If your doctor suspected that you had cancer, they are not just going to go in and start poking you with a needle and biopsying. They are absolutely going to take images first, right? And we see that as well in the oil and gas industry. It used to be that you would go out and just start drilling wells. Now, the oil companies recognize that there is a high return on investment if they actually spend the time and money to use seismic surveys before they start drilling for wells. And going back to this medical analogy, I did a little bit of research on potential savings for using a scan first approach. And there are some estimates that say a minimum of 20% can be saved on treatment costs if scanning is used first. And that helps with early detection and more concrete action items moving forward. So what I thought was interesting about that statistic, the 20% savings on treatment costs, is that's actually not that far out of line with what we saw as an estimate from the EPA. So that kind of tells us that 20% is probably not the max. It's actually more like the minimum cost savings that can be realized after using a scan first approach. Now, at this point, we're talking about scanning first in the environmental industry. Since most people probably haven't seen this done before, I'm going to go ahead and show a short video that illustrates what scanning in the environmental industry actually looks like, so that as we move forward through our comparison of drilling versus scanning, we have a little bit of a concept about what this actually, how this plays out. So if we take a typical gas station site, you assume there was some leaks, there's subsurface contamination. What we've been saying is traditional methods, say come out, drill a few wells, that'll tell you everything you need to know, remediate, you'll be fine, except you're not fine, right? You find that you still have more, you missed things, right? What's happening between the wells? So scan first says use electrical resistivity imaging, install stakes in the ground, send a current through the ground, and then you can get a picture of the 3D resistivity structure of the subsurface. And from that, you can figure out flow paths, contaminant distribution, bioactivity levels, and now you're building a conceptual site model that is informed by tens of thousands of data points about subsurface conditions, rather than just maybe the tens that you would have from traditional monitoring wells. Now, when you have those complete pictures and you actually have images that you can use to target your remediation, you can actually go back, and now your drilling money, your remediation money is being spent much more effectively because you have this roadmap to actually tell you what it's going to take to reach site closure. So that's just a really short overview of what scanning in the environmental industry will look like. We'll kind of dig into the technical aspects of that after we talk about comparing scanning versus drilling on a technical and a cost basis approach. So let's think about characterization certainty, scanning or wells. Let's say you've got a really simple site, just you truly have one source, one flow path, and it's a small site, 200 feet by 200 feet. So if you go out and you just drill wells in a grid structure, your site investigation might look something like this. Right? You've got evenly spaced wells, it takes about 25 wells to cover this area. And what have you learned? Well, we got one hit here, so we found part of our source area, but do we understand where the contamination is flowing? Do we understand any offsite migration? And the answer from this installation of wells is we do not. However, if you take a scan approach, so you scan at the same intervals that you installed wells, now you understand a lot more. right? So instead of just having one impacted zone detected, you have 8 different zones detected. You have the extent of the impacts much better understood. You know where to look next, and you actually have an idea of where this flow path is on the site and where offsite migration is occurring. So from a certainty perspective, we can see that you actually get a lot more clear next steps by just looking at the scan first approach. When we ask the question, well, why does certainty matter? Right? Certainty is one of those things when we're talking about the cost of monitoring wells, it's really hard to quantify certainty, right? It's a more qualitative measurement that is pretty meaningful, as we see in the study that I mentioned earlier by the SCRDP. So this is one of their examples where this yellow plume was their source zone. This red outline here is what one of the teams interpreted to be the source zone. And as a result of this interpretation, installed all of their injection wells where you see these black dots. So what they found is that there was a lot of wasted money spent treating this area over here, whereas parts of this source zone were left completely untreated. And they did see, one of the other key findings of the study was that poor estimates of DNAPL mass and the source zone footprint were directly linked to failure to meet the project objectives following remediation. So it's hard to quantify certainty, but they absolutely showed that having certainty in your source zone and plume delineation is what's going to allow remediation to be successful. And in fact, in 40% of the cases where they applied a safety factor of around 30, that still could not overcome their CSM limitations. And when I talk about a factor of safety here, I'm referring to the fact that they were doing electron donor injections into the ground. And so they would inject more than 30 times what you would calculate that you would think you would need. And even that wasn't enough to actually overcome a poor CSM. So while certainty is hard to quantify, it's absolutely something that is important for an overall CSM development. If we come back to our simple example and now start looking at costs, if you look at the rough costs to do this investigation on the left, you're looking at about $114,000. And that's just for well installation, construction, and 1 round of sampling. I took out any kind of reporting or management costs there. When you look at our example on the right, our scan first approach, a scan like this, where you've got roughly 10 scans, could run around $200,000 for a site. So is 200,000, yes, more, is it the 200,000 more than 114? Yes, it definitely is. However, when you look at comparative costs per area coverage, so let's assume that a well is representative of a 5-foot radius around itself, and a scan is representative of a 5-foot swath. By doing this well drilling, you are actually only sampling less than 1% of the subsurface. Whereas with scanning, you have actually scanned 25% of the subsurface. So when you look at the cost per square foot of area coverage, now you see a huge difference, right? That well is costing $230 per square foot, whereas the scan is only $20 per square foot. So from a cost basis comparison for area coverage, the scanning is definitely more cost efficient. But the dirty little secret with monitoring wells is that it's usually not just a one-time cost, right? Unlike the scanning. The scanning is a one-time cost. You get it done, you have your path forward, you move on. Wells actually really add up. So I took a look at what does a well cost over its entire lifetime. So let's say we look at wells installed to 3 different depths, 20 feet, 50 feet, 75 feet. And let's say that those wells stay in the ground for anywhere from 5 to 10 to 20 years. If you assume that that one well has to be constructed, so installed, rehabilitated, removed at the end of its lifetime, it's sampled quarterly, and there's an annual monitoring report and a conditions report every 5 years to talk about those wells, then your one well at this high end of this 75-foot well, one well over the course of its lifetime could cost almost $200,000. right? Now, that's a big number, right? That's the cost of one well. This is not how we typically think about wells, right? We think about wells as a cheap method of investigation, but what we find is they definitely do add up. And this is roughly the same cost as that entire imaging event that we looked at on the previous slide. Now, the other interesting thing is these costs don't include inflation, right? So if you actually think about what's happening to well costs over time, what we've seen in the past decade is roughly a 33% increase in well costs. So there's this hidden cost to wells that is not often discussed, right? If we make the decision to start investigating with wells now, as opposed to taking a scan first approach, how much money is this actually costing us? Well, it's costing us a lot to keep sampling, and it's also costing us in the fact that we know we're not going to have as much certainty. We might have to keep drilling wells again and again and again over the next decade to better understand the site, and those costs are going to continue increasing as well. So while is a picture worth 1,000 wells? Is that exactly true? Well, we just showed not quite, but in terms of the certainty, I would argue we're probably getting very close to this being a true maxim for the environmental industry, that a picture could be worth 1,000 wells, especially because that continuous imaging allows us to answer the regulators with, I know exactly what's happening between the wells that I do have. And not only that, but I use the images to guide my well installation so that I know I'm getting the most meaningful data possible for my site. So overall, if we talk about the benefits of a scan first approach, what we just looked at is that you are absolutely increasing your conceptual site model accuracy and certainty. That's going to result in a higher probability of investigation and remedial success. And that's going to lead to much more cost-efficient results on an overall project basis. On the short term, you're getting the equivalent data coverage at less than 1/10 the cost of a well. So short term, you're making a smart financial decision. And long term, you can actually scan the entire site for the lifetime costs of one well. So that's a good investment. And then you also have the ability to have targeted remediation, which again, using that medical analogy, could result for a minimum of 20% savings on remediation or treatment, if you're talking about the medical. So at this point, hopefully we're seeing, yes, it does look like scan first might be the appropriate approach. But what does that actually look like? So now we get to dig into a little more of the technical side and learn, what does scanning first look like in the environmental industry? And at ASTIS, we like to talk about scanning first as our electrical hydrogeology services. So we don't say just take a picture and walk away, right? That's like hiring a photographer and they just send you a few photos. They don't do any of the development. They don't do, or they send you the camera reel, basically. They don't do the development. They don't actually look at it, maybe do a few things to make it easier to understand. So we say you need electrical hydrogeology. You use your electrical scans, and you also leverage all of the other existing data sets that we have in the environmental industry to help us better understand subsurface conditions. And you integrate the two so that you can get targeted drilling, and those drilling results can actually help you calibrate what the electrical resistivity image is telling you. So this in the field is actually a very simple, non-invasive setup. So it starts off with electrode stakes that are hammered into the ground, and it's considered non-invasive because we're just going down roughly 12 to 18 inches into the subsurface. Then you connect those electrode stakes with an electrode cable. You hook that up to the instrument, and when you collect your complete data set, you get this trapezoidal array of electrical resistivity values. And the way you got this was because when you hooked this cable up to the measurement instrument, you were sending current through the subsurface. And that's how you get that measurement for electrical resistivity. So field setup, the only few things that you have to worry about is making sure that all of those stakes are in a straight line. And the other big consideration for site logistics is that your line length must be 5 times your imaging depth. So if you want to look down 100 feet, then you have to have enough space on the ground to go cover 500 feet to be able to get that depth of interest that you need. And with these electrical images, like I said, we have an array, a trapezoidal array of electrical resistivity values. That is the actual data set, the electrical data set in the electrical hydrogeology process. And what do these resistivity values mean, right? That's really what we care about. Unless you work on our team, you probably don't care very much about the exact resistivity values. So the important thing to remember is that when we take a picture of the subsurface, you are seeing everything in the subsurface. So every single one of these pixels is actually the sum of all of these different signals. If there's biological activity, if there's contamination or injectates in the ground, what the groundwater and fluids are looking like, are they salt water, are they fresh water, and then what's the native geology look like? You see all of these different signals in your images. And the important thing to remember when you're reading these images, because we're going to look at a few examples here, is that these 4 signals are not created equal. So what that means is if you have contamination in the subsurface, that's going to actually likely overprint a native geology signature. Whereas if you didn't have any contamination, you would better see those different lithologic contacts. Now at this point, and ask on the basics of electrical hydrogeology. What are we measuring? How does it work? Any questions?
Sam, if you'd like, I can open up the mics for everybody so they can ask questions. Would you like me to do that?
I would have said yes, but I don't see any hands raised, so
I'm going to allow everybody.
We got a hand raised. Yes, please. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Everybody's mic should be open now.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I was wondering if you can talk about
Yes.
the sensitivity of how low can you see concentrations of a contamination, and then what effects do you have with salinity, or if you're in brackish water, will that mess up seeing the contamination? Or are you able to filter through salinity issues and lower levels of contamination?
Great question. We're going to dig into that more.
Sam, you're having a little bit of issues on technical. I think we may have lost Sam. Kyle, are you able to answer that question?
Yeah, absolutely. And like Sam said, that's a great question. You're Sam, you might be back.
Okay, I was like, sorry, I could definitely hear you guys. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I have a blip. Come back.
Maybe turn your camera off, Sam. Yeah, maybe turn your camera off and see if your audio will improve.
Will do.
Much better.
Okay, great. Well, sorry to cut you off then, Kyle. So yeah, great question. First part of that was concentrations of contaminants. So contamination, we say we are only directly detecting this contamination if you're at about 1 ppm or greater. But we're actually really good at finding dissolved phase plumes at lower concentrations, because at that point, what you're trying to understand is the hydrogeology of the subsurface. So your contamination is likely following those preferential pathways, and that's something that we can map even if the contaminant concentration is a lot lower. In terms of salinity effects, salinity does fall into this groundwater fluid signature. It is very highly conductive. So very, very low resistivity. And that is a very strong signature on our images, right? So we're good at finding conductive areas. But the great thing is, and we're going to dig into this when we talk about the GeoTrax survey difference. The great thing about our GeoTrax survey electrical resistivity images versus standard resistivity images is that they were actually developed with a higher level of sensitivity that lets them see even resistive materials in those high saline environments. And we'll look at an example of that later. Looks like we've got another question from John.
Yes, Sam, how do you deal with the vertical resolution issues? What kind of vertical resolution are you looking at with the resistivity? And then how do you integrate that with sub-centimeter resolution in a wellbore or a LIF tool, and then bringing that to the resolution with your electrical stuff. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. And you just mentioned a great pairing of technologies there, because I'd say the real winner with using a scan first approach is the fact that you got that answer as to what's going on between the wells. The resolution is 1/2 of the electrode spacing. So if you have electrodes spaced 1 meter apart, that's roughly 3 feet. That means your pixel size, thinking about this graphic here, your pixel size is roughly 1.5 feet by 1.5 feet. So yes, you can definitely get a higher vertical resolution with some of those other drilling technologies, which is what makes them so great to pair together. And it depends on what it is you're trying to look for. If you're looking for a major lithologic break or flow path, that is still something that's going to affect the electrical resistivity image. However, if you want to find a 1-foot clay lens and your image is looking down, 700 feet, such that your pixel size is a lot larger, you might not be able to pick out a 1-foot, discrete clay lens. But you can still see the areas of greatest interest. And so when you then combine the image with the drilling technology, you can actually integrate those two data sets, and that helps you calibrate the image to the subsurface conditions and sort of pull those signals out better. Any other
questions? Oh.
Okay. I either did a really good or really poor job answering those two. Okay. So we'll go ahead and move forward. And now that we understand the basics of electrical resistivity imaging, we'll take a look at a few application examples. So this first case study is an example where the imaging results completely redefine the CSM. So the premise for this project was that there were some LNAPL seeps, which this picture right here is at high tide. You can see the water level is high. You can actually see this boom coming across here, because when the water level drops, you could actually see LNAPL coming straight up out of the ground, just leaking into the water when the water level was high. And there's a retaining wall up behind this area, which you can see sort of poking out right here in this image. And apologies for some of the pictures here. This is a somewhat confidential site, so this is what we were allowed to share. But anyway, they installed a retaining wall, and they were still having a seep problem. And that was confusing, because the conceptual site model said, well, we know this area was built up with contaminated fill, so we think it's just coming from this area, dipping below the retaining wall, and that's what's causing these seeps that we're seeing. But then with the retaining wall installed so deep down into this layers, the question was, well, how is this stuff getting under the retaining wall? So we came out and we took several images. This example image, it was actually one collected over the water. And you can see this orange dot here is where a seep location was on the surface. And what we saw was that if you track this brown anomaly here, there was this brown anomaly was pointing straight up towards that seep zone. And it wasn't starting from a really shallow interval, it was starting from much deeper, this down below this -4 interval. So what we found out was that the CSM actually wasn't that the fill was causing the seep. The actual source of the seep was much deeper. Impacted Pleistocene channels were then causing the LNAPL to float up at this coastline. So as a result of this huge shift in CSM, our client was actually able to go back. They drilled some deeper wells, hit these flow paths, and they've continuously had feet of LNAPL that they've actually been pumping out of those wells. So this is an example of where CSM certainty really did help improve remedial outcomes. But we're talking about costs and numbers. So let's look at a few examples where we can actually have tie a number to this impact that certainty had. So this is another refinery site where they had found LNAPL in wells more than 1 mile from the refinery, and it was at depths of more than 350 feet BGS. So really big problem, really widespread area. And because the groundwater was so deep in this zone, the wells were very expensive to drill. They were each cost about $180,000. So this was one where the project managers said, yeah, we definitely need to scan first because we cannot poke enough holes out here to understand how things are moving, and we definitely can't do it with each one costing $180,000. The result of the scans were that we were able to actually map these deep paleo channels that were higher permeability and controlling all of the contaminant migration off of the refinery. So you can see in this example image here that down at depth, when you start getting to 350 feet, there was this very channel-shaped structure. And when it was drilled, 5 feet of LNAPL came right in. And when we just look a few hundred feet over, there's a well drilled at the same depth interval. No LNAPL was in that well. And this was a pre-existing well. So it really highlighted the fact that you needed the image to target these discrete paleo channels. The great thing was that we were then able to image more than 3 miles down through this domain. And we were able to use these images to map the network of paleo channels that existed down at this depth of 350 feet BGS. An added point of confusion and concern on this project was that there were some down gradient pumping wells that they were worried were causing the LNAPL to migrate even more quickly through these paleo channels. But because we then were able to map the paleo channel locations, they could actually feed those locations into their groundwater models, and they could model the effect of pumping on the LNAPL migration. And that allowed them to make informed decisions on which wells, from a risk-based standpoint, actually needed to be turned off versus which ones were perfectly acceptable to leave on and keep pumping away. So the estimates on this project were that we actually saved our client roughly $20 million in characterization costs alone, right? And getting the number out for the remediation is still being determined. But they definitely have targets, and they have a solid groundwater model that they can hang their hat on at this point. This next project is also about finding flow paths, but on a much smaller scale. So this was a small dry cleaner site located in Washington. So heterogeneous glacial till was the geologic environment. And the main problem on this site was that it was an old dry cleaner. It was a brownfield redevelopment site. They needed to move quickly and clean up the PCE that was still in the ground. But the confusing part was that they knew they had a shallow plume and a deeper plume, but they didn't know how the two were connecting. So we scanned the entire site, and on this image, one of the things that might pop out to you is this sort of diving purple anomaly right here. And when this purple anomaly was drilled, it came back with much higher intervals of sand compared to surrounding wells. So that told us that on a hydrogeologic basis, we had definitely found this distinct vertical flow feature that was controlling the downward migration of contaminants on this site. And when those wells were actually sampled, that was confirmed. There are much significantly higher concentrations of PCE and daughter products in those 2 wells compared to surrounding wells. So for example, this well over here was not even above regulatory standards. So in terms of, taking a step back and thinking big picture, what's really striking is this flow path is only 10 feet wide. So if you think about even along this one transect, this 200 plus foot long transect, this is definitely like playing darts with the ground and throwing wells in and hoping you hit the bullseye, except you don't have the benefit of seeing the bullseye unless you have the image first. And as a result of better understanding the vertical flow paths and the off-site contaminant migration, they were able to refine their remedial strategy, and they estimated that they saved roughly $3.7 million on remediation. So when you think about the scan for a whole site costing $200,000, well, that just paid for itself many, many times over in the remedial savings cost. Now, this last example that we're looking at is for an LNAPL in karst site. So what happened was there was an above ground diesel storage tank. More than 2,000 gallons of diesel were spilled right into the ground next to this municipal supply well that was actually open casing down to depth. So And then they found LNAPL in this well at 100 feet BGS. So this was definitely, they knew right away this was going to be a very complicated problem to solve, because in a karst environment, you're really dealing with fracture controlled or dissolution controlled preferential pathways. So our images came in, we said, okay, this nice red bullseye right here, that looks to be your remaining, this looks impacted, your remaining source material could be hanging out right here. So all of this image was able to guide all of these remediation wells. It was confirmed that this had free product, and it was this little gray leg coming off here had dissolved phase in it. And then over here was non-detect. So we were able to provide an image that helped us better understand the karst structure in the subsurface and the contaminant distribution. What was really great about this site is that we actually took this a step further, and we collected an additional data set right over the first one, such that you could track the changes in electrical resistivity. So in the way that a monitoring well can sense changes in contaminant concentrations over time, we can do the same thing with electrical resistivity and see how did the surface change electrically. And this example, you can see where we had our big zone of contamination before and our flow path, that entire area got much more electrically conductive. So the wells were coming back as saying, we're clean, we got everything out. And we also had the images to back it up and say, yep, it looked like this area got more conductive. We were able to remove this area of contamination, and bioactivity is actually going on and helping to degrade what was left in the subsurface. So at the end of the day, they were able to actually close this site in less than 2 years with all of these wells getting down to non-detect. So big success, and this well was able to come back online to provide groundwater to the community. Now, our earlier question on sensitivity, how does that matter? We're going to get into a little bit with that now with what's the difference at ASTIS, right? One of the things that we hate hearing from people is, oh, well, I tried geophysics at my site and it just didn't work. And we understand that feedback, right? And so that's why we're doing things a little bit differently, because we don't want people to have that feedback after they work with us. So there are 3 key things that are different about what we're doing at ASIS versus a standard electrical resistivity imaging provider. So first off, it is truly better data, and I talked about this a little bit before. Our GeoTrax survey data are higher sensitivity than other traditional data sets. That means we can actually see things that others can't, and we're going to look at an example of that on the next slide. But we can't discount these other 2 things that make us different, which is our proven process. So you saw on a lot of these example case studies that you weren't often just looking at a single electrical resistivity image, right? You were looking at that image integrated with well data, right? So we were using that well data to calibrate the imagery to these subsurface conditions. We always do 3D modeling because we believe that to understand a 3D structure, we have to see it in 3D first. We also have really robust QA/QC procedures that are applied at every step of our process to make sure that every step of the way, we are delivering high quality, accurate results. And this interpretation, this is huge. A lot of times we hear from people who've worked with standard ERI providers that, oh, well, I got the data and it just wasn't very useful. They just handed me a bunch of data sets and walked away. And we take a more collaborative approach, and that's because we really value our specialized team, right? So all of our people are highly trained experts in the field work, in interpreting electrical images, and we all come from unique backgrounds. So we have a team of geophysicists, geologists, hydrogeologists, environmental technicians, and we bring that diverse team together so that when we're analyzing a site, we're actually looking at it from every single angle. And that's what's key to this interpretation, right? We have looked at thousands of images worldwide. So we have, if it's out there, I would say we've seen it, but then again, we always still seem to get surprised. So just we continually are shocked by how heterogeneous and unique the subsurface can actually be. And that's with our really specialized team who does this day in, day out. But that interpretive team is what makes this data more valuable. So circling back to this better data issue, this is actually an example on an EPA site, and this was a post-remedial evaluation of the site. So what that meant was they had remediated, and we got to come in and we took images. We used our GeoTrax survey protocols, and we applied standard electrical resistivity imaging protocols. And the difference between the two images is striking. So in this first image, we see two very strong, very clear anomalies. And in this second image, we see only one anomaly, and you'll notice the center of it is definitely shifted. And when these were drilled, it was actually found that these two anomalies that really stood out, they were both impacted at fairly high levels. So again, what was interesting here is this was a post-remedial evaluation. So, you know, if you're having trouble cleaning up your site, this is why, right? There's a lot of stuff that can get stuck in the ground that's hard to see with just wells. This image also proved the reverse to be true. So higher impacted borings were in these anomalies that we thought were contamination, and borings that were not in the center of those anomalies actually came back a lot cleaner. So that's the big difference with standard traditional electrical resistivity imaging versus ACES's GeoTrax Survey electrical resistivity imaging. And circling back to the whole point of this presentation, you know, what's your monitoring well actually costing you? Is, you know, let's look at big picture environmental industry and characterization standards. So a lot of times people ask the question like, well, you know, $200,000, that's a lot. Can we even afford to scan before we start remediating? And I think we've shown, as we've worked through this, is the real question is, can we be affording not to scan prior to remediation? Right? Medical industry says, no, we cannot. I cannot afford to start treating my patient without scanning first. Oil and gas industry says, no, I have to scan for this oil before I start drilling for it. And so then the question might be, well, if these other industries have gone that direction and we haven't, you know, why? Why isn't scanning common practice in the environmental industry? And so I pulled out this very long quote from that SCRDP study that I keep referencing, because it really made me think. So I wanted to share that with all of you today. So I'm going to read it and kind of unpack it with you. So they cited that even after giving some of their teams best practices on how to use the well data, they found that a certain degree of momentum of practice was occurring, whereby practitioners continue to do what they were trained to do or what has worked for them in the past. That concept of what has worked in the past is somewhat uncertain in the environmental field, as the ultimate goalpost, no further action, is rarely achieved at groundwater contaminated sites. And many sites continue through multiple investigation phases and 5-year reviews of the remedy. So that was just fascinating. So they're saying, okay, at a certain point, people are just doing what they're doing because they say, oh, it's worked for me in the past. Right? And we do hear that when we talk to folks, oh, monitoring wells worked for me worked for me before. But this second part of the statement kind of raises the question, did it though? Did it really work? We're seeing on the environmental industry as a whole that many sites are not reaching no further action. They are not being cleaned up. And these remediations are going through multiple 5-year reviews. So that says, was it really effective? Did we actually reach success doing what we were doing in the past? And this thought of taking a little while to bring something new on board is not new either. This is something that we see is very common. This is known as the product or technology adoption curve. And you can think about this even in terms of cell phones, right? Think about when smartphones came on the market. At first, it was just those few cool folks that had a smartphone, right? Now, everyone's got a smartphone, right? But it takes time. It's not overnight. And we kind of see ourselves as being right here. ACES is not new. Electrical resistivity imaging in general has been around for over 100 years. right? There have absolutely been people who've been leveraging it, and we're seeing this uptick starting to happen because people are starting to see those cost benefits that we were going through, the benefits to improvement of the overall project outcomes by using a scan-first approach. And one last quote for you today. This one refers to the use of seismic in the oil and gas industry. And it comments on the fact that back in the day, seismic reflections were not even considered on par with the divining rod, for at least that device had a background of tradition. So I feel like this is kind of where we are in the environmental industry with monitoring wells and a scan-first approach, is that we have a strong tradition of monitoring wells. We know how to move forward that process. Scanning is still feeling like this new thing that we're trying to work our head around. But like we've been talking about, we are seeing that the scanning is actually the underlying principle, the underlying best practice for modern characterization, right? Treating monitoring wells as characterization wells is not working for the industry. We see that in several studies. We see that just using vertical tools alone is not going to be sufficient for a good conceptual site model. While they are an integral part of the good conceptual site model, you cannot just use those and expect to get to a good final answer. And that makes sense because we are only going to clean up the site if we understand what we're cleaning up, right? You kind of have to see the problem to solve the problem. We've looked at other industries where scanning first is an accepted best practice and seen how they actually have applied it, and now it's completely standard as part of their practices. And then we've also looked at how at ACES, our electrical hydrogeology approach is not just scan first, right? It's a lot more than that. It's scanning first, using integrated data, generating targeted drilling locations, generating a robust conceptual site model so that you can have time and cost savings for both characterization and remediation on the back end of your project. Look at a lot of different articles when building out this presentation. So I have all these references here if you're curious to learn more about those articles as well. And with that, I hope you have a better sense of what your monitoring well is actually costing you, and you enjoyed our foray into really discussing what is a cost-effective means of site characterization. And we are in our second Q&A session. So any questions?
I'm not seeing any hands up or anybody asking questions. I checked in the Q&A spot as well, nothing there. Any further questions for Samantha? No? Sam, you did a great job. So,
that or a really poor job, one of the two.
No.
It's always what the questions make you think.
Well, I just want to let everybody know, at least from the administrative side, I will be putting together the recording of this as well as the CE certificates this week, and they should go out by the end of the week to everybody. So that'll get taken care of and you should receive those. If you have any questions, my email has been in the different emails that have gone out, my address, so please don't hesitate to reach out to me there. Or there's also the email right here on the screen, the sales-team@ACES LLC is another way that you can reach out to us if you've got further questions in regards to today's presentation. I think on that note, if there's no questions, I think we're good to go. Anybody else have anything else to add from our team?
Well, great. Just thank you all so much for your time and sitting in and listening to me talk for an hour.
Yes. Thank you, everybody. You have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.